This week on Second Take, Africa's political stage serves us a three-course meal of ego, diplomacy, and dynastic ambition. From Cupcake Ramaphosa and Donald Trumpstein's G20 theatrics, where global powers behaved like jealous cousins fighting over Christmas leftovers, to Hakainde Hichilema's diplomatic marathon that felt like Zambia's speed dating session for world influence, to Tanzania's cabinet reshuffle that looks suspiciously like a family reunion with government salaries. Africa's headlines are once again reminding us why shows like Second Take were created. Because if your country feels chaotic, trust me, somebody else is doing worse. Let's get into the show.
Save the date for November 26, 2025, when all registered voters head to the polls for the regional councils and local authorities elections. Your voice matters, and your vote is your voice. Head to your nearest polling station and elect your leaders. Remember, every vote counts. Get involved, put your voice in the box. Vote on November 26, 2025.
Let's be honest, South Africa's G20 week was always going to be dramatic. After all, it's hard to host the first G20 summit on African soil without someone somewhere catching feelings. But nobody quite expected the spectacle to reach the point where global diplomacy started sounding like Joburg Twitter during load shedding. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the United States might suddenly change its mind about boycotting the G20 summit in Johannesburg, and said it with the confidence of a man who knows the weather could probably change.
We have received notice from the United States, a notice which we are still in discussions with them over, about a change of mind about participating in one shape, form or other in the summit. So the discussions are still ongoing. This comes really at the late hour before the summit begins. And so therefore we do need to engage in those types of discussions to see how practical it is and what it finally really means. In a way, we see this as a positive sign, very positive, because, as I've often said, boycott politics never work. It's always best to be inside the tent than being outside of the tent. The tent is G20, all countries are here, and the United States, being the biggest economy in the world, needs to be here. So it's pleasing to hear that there is a change of approach, and so we are still discussing how that will manifest.
Aye, Cyril, I can understand your excitement, because South Africa's presidency had been hyping the summit with the themes of solidarity, equality, and sustainability, pushing issues like debt relief, climate adaptation funding, and a just energy transition. You know, the kind of topics the global South considers survival and certain global North players consider optional afterthoughts. Ramaphosa even called the US shift a positive development, reminding the world that the United States, being the biggest economy in the world, needs to be there, as if trying to convince a stubborn relative to show up for Christmas lunch without starting a fight. Meanwhile, in the background, the original US boycott had its own dramatic origin story from the Trump administration, fueled by Trump's repeated claims that South Africa was violently persecuting white Afrikaner farmers, allegations South Africa has denied, pointing instead to broader crime and not targeted racial violence, and the US decision in May to grant refugee status to Afrikaner farmers, which strained ties like a bad WhatsApp family group fight. Then came the G20 agenda drama, with Trump criticizing South Africa's priorities as promoting DEI and climate change, his version of diplomatic swear words, by the way, and brushing them off as anti-American, before announcing the boycott on Truth Social and choosing instead to host the 2026 G20 at his Miami Doral resort with what he called a streamlined economic focus, which in practice usually means fewer things to argue about and more things to sell. Add in the broader tensions, South Africa's ICJ case against Israel over Gaza, the US disapproval, and Trump's view of land reform and affirmative action as discriminatory against white. And the cocktail of grievances was already well shaken before Ramaphosa added his public optimism. He had previously brushed off the potential US absence as their loss, promising the summit would proceed and deliver fundamental decisions which might go down as one of the most stubbornly optimistic lines in African diplomacy. But then Washington responded with the speed of someone who doesn't want to be left out of a group chat argument. The White House called Ramaphosa's remarks fake news, clarifying that only the U.S. chargé d'affaires in Pretoria would attend the handover ceremony at the summit's close, purely to transfer the G20 presidency from South Africa to the U.S., and insisted the U.S. was not joining G20 discussions. No high-level delegation, not even Vice President J.D. Vance, whose name had circulated like a maybe guest at a wedding who never RSVP'd, would attend any substantive talks. Then came the statement from U.S. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, and it set X on fire.
The United States is not participating in official talks at the G20 in South Africa. I saw the South African president running his mouth a little bit against the United States and the president of the United States earlier today, and that language is not appreciated by the president or his team. The ambassador or the representative of the embassy in South Africa is simply there to recognize that the United States will be the host of the G20. They are receiving that send-off at the end of the event. They are not there to participate in official talks, despite what the South African president is falsely claiming.
Running his mouth. Aside from the blatant disrespect, the statement is rich, coming from someone who works for a man that built a political career entirely on running his mouth. Of course, this landed badly in Pretoria, where Ramaphosa's spokesperson Vincent Magwenya countered that Ramaphosa would not hand over the presidency to a low-level chargé d'affaires and insisted on appropriate representation, turning the whole thing into a protocol battle that felt like arguing whether your cousin must dress formally before being allowed at the family table. Then came reports that South Africa rejected accreditation for an initial U.S. delegation of 8 and told them to collect handover documents from the Department of International Relations in Pretoria instead, the global diplomatic equivalent of your parcel is at the post office. Good luck. European leaders added their own flavor to the mix. Ursula von der Leyen expressed hope for U.S. engagement, while German Chancellor Friedrich Merz admitted he wasn't sure what would happen. A rare moment when Europe collectively looked at a diplomatic mess and said, honestly, our guess is as good as yours. The result was an international standoff where Trump's America First posture risked isolating the U.S. from global South priorities, while South Africa's diplomatic assertiveness put it in the unfamiliar position of having to simultaneously host the party and mediate the guest list. It will be a long time before this diplomatic tug-of-war comes to an end. All we know is that Trump needs to keep the headlines flowing faster than the release of the Epstein files. So, safe to say, he'll be running his mouth for a while. In mid-November 2025, Zambia's President Hakainde Hichilema appeared to be speed-running African diplomacy like a man trying to cram an entire presidential term into one long weekend. It all began on November 12 when Hichilema hosted Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, at State House in Lusaka, a meeting so economically wholesome that even the opposition had to pause their daily outrage to acknowledge that if you're going to host anyone, it might as well be the man with more industries than most African countries have traffic lights. The two discussed job creation, industrial growth, and energy diversification, essentially the holy trinity of modern African problems. And Hichilema praised Dangote as a symbol of Africa's entrepreneurial spirit, which in diplomatic language translates to "Welcome, sir, please, invest aggressively, please." Because Dangote already operates in more than 10 African countries, Zambia naturally wants a slice of the cement and infrastructure empire, especially after its own post-debt restructuring efforts to attract foreign direct investment, making this meeting the least controversial thing to happen in Southern African politics that entire week. But the diplomacy train did not stop there. Around November 16, Hichilema met with Donald Trump Jr., who was in Zambia on a private vacation, because why should only animals go on safari when geopolitics clearly enjoys the adventure too? The meeting was informal, with Hichilema using the moment to send warm regards to US President Donald Trump and reaffirm Zambia's interest in strengthening US-Zambia ties, subtly showing Washington that Lusaka remains stable, investor-friendly, and absolutely open for business, even while the US was busy boycotting the G20 summit in South Africa. Trump Jr., touring Zambia's attractions, provided the perfect soft power photo op. America gets a friendly African partner, Zambia gets a tourism advert, and everyone gets to forget that Zimbabwe's Mnangagwa once tried to hand Trump a piece of Victoria Falls for a golf course. That's a real story. But the diplomatic tour took a sharp left when Hichilema met Wigno Chivayo, Zimbabwe's most polarizing businessman, at State House, a man known regionally as a tenderpreneur, a term that combines tender and entrepreneur into something that sounds respectable until you remember it often translates to expert in winning government contracts via connections. Chivayo posted about the meeting like a man whose data bundle was about to expire, and their talks covered the renewable energy problems caused by low water levels at Kariba North Dam, as well as infrastructure challenges and private sector funding models. Chivayo called Hichilema a pan-Africanist and economic reformer, which was flattering, but not particularly comforting. Because when a man convicted of fraud in 2007 starts praising your reforms, even your supporters start to blink slowly. Meanwhile, Hichilema emphasized the shared Zambia-Zimbabwe history, which is true. But critics argued that the real shared history here was a shared ability of politically connected businessmen to reinvent themselves through carefully curated photo opportunities. And because Chivayo has ties to Mnangagwa ZANU-PF, some outlets, such as Zim-I, immediately called the Lusaka meeting a photo op for his image rehabilitation tour, which seems to be going quite well, given that he has met Kenya's William Ruto and he sat in Samia Suluhu Hassan's State House like a spoiled teenager. Or is it spoiled ballot? Who knows? The real diplomatic plot twist, however, came with Hichilema's state visit to Harare for the inaugural Zambia-Zimbabwe Binational Commission, where the atmosphere shifted so dramatically that spectators wondered whether the two presidents had undergone personality transplants. Relations between Hichilema and Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa had been terrible, especially after the disputed 2023 elections in Zimbabwe, especially because a SADC mission led by Hichilema's appointee Nevers Mumba criticized the polls. By last year, Mnangagwa was accusing Zambia of harboring Zimbabwean opposition figures and even sought Russian military support to protect himself from what he perceived as US-backed threats coming from Zambia. But suddenly, in November, all hostility evaporated. Hichilema repeatedly called Mnangagwa his elder brother, citing their shared days at the University of Zambia, while Mnangagwa responded with warm declarations that the people of both countries should support each other's visions, effectively rebranding themselves as Africa's latest political brotherhood. The two even described the countries as Siamese twins joined at the umbilical cord, a phrase clinical enough to make medical practitioners cringe, but poetic enough to distract from years of diplomatic hostility. They signed MOUs on trade, lithium mining, tariff reductions, and cross-border infrastructure because nothing bonds neighbors like mutually beneficial minerals. Hichilema also openly called for Western sanctions on Zimbabwe, including those imposed on Mnangagwa and his allies, to be lifted, signaling a major shift in tone, especially considering this was the same man whose government played a role in calling out Zimbabwe's flawed election just 2 years ago. While critics in Zambia claim this newfound brotherhood represents a setback for Hichilema's human rights stance, others argue it stabilizes SADC relations at a time when the region is juggling energy crises, debt problems, and enough political contradictions to fill 1,000 pages of satire. Taken together, Hichilema's November diplomatic sprint paints the picture of a president committed to business-first diplomacy, where the goal is to attract investment, Dangote, strengthen Western ties, Trump Jr., expand regional energy solutions, Zimbabwe, and mend fences with Mnangagwa. It is the geopolitical equivalent of multitasking. One moment you are selling Zambia as an economic hub, the next moment you are shaking hands with a controversial businessman whose very online presence can cause a small political tremor, and then the next you are calling the president of a recently hostile neighbor your elder brother in front of cameras. The strategy may be ambitious, but it's also risky. While Dangote brings clean optics and clear benefits, the Chivayo meeting raises ethical concerns that could tarnish Hichilema's carefully cultivated reformist image if any partnership collapses under the weight of Chivayo's reputation. Likewise, the reconciliation with Mnangagwa, welcome as it may be for regional stability, will certainly be watched with suspicion by both Zambian and Zimbabwean opposition figures who are already labeling it opportunistic and politically convenient. Yet none of that stops Hichilema from positioning Zambia as a regional hub for diplomacy, investment, and energy deals, using every tool available, from tourist-driven soft power to Pan-African Brotherhood rhetoric to business-friendly charm offensives. Whether this flurry of meetings ultimately strengthens Zambia's regional standing or complicates its political narrative depends on how these relationships develop and how loudly Zimbabwean media and Zambian opposition circles choose to scream in the months ahead. For now, what is undeniable is that Hichilema has embraced diplomacy with the speed and enthusiasm of a man determined to make Zambia relevant on every front: economic, regional, political, and satirical, whether his critics enjoy the show or not. Inside Chamwino State House in Dodoma, Tanzania, President Samia Suluhu Hassan unveiled her new cabinet with the serene confidence of a leader who knows the country can protest only as loudly as her security forces allow, presenting 27 ministers and 29 deputies wrapped in the language of efficiency and accountability, though the real theme seemed to be family, friends, and anyone who answers her calls on the first ring. Because Tanzania quickly realized the cabinet list read less like a governance strategy and more like the seating arrangement at a very exclusive family wedding. The star appointment, of course, was Wamu Hafid Amir, the president's 43-year-old daughter, who earned the title of Deputy Minister of Education, Science, and Technology under Professor Adolf Mkenda, making it the first time in Tanzanian history that an education portfolio looked like a direct extension of the family WhatsApp group. Yes, Wanu has been a CCM MP, since 2005 and sits in the Zanzibar House of Representatives. And yes, she retained her seat in the 2025 election, but the coincidence of merit aligning perfectly with oldest child is the kind of miracle that makes even religious leaders pause and reconsider what counts as divine intervention. Not to be outdone, the Minister of Health is now Mohammed Mchengerwa, her 46-year-old son-in-law, fresh from becoming the CCM MP for refugee in Pwani region with absolutely no prior cabinet experience, but who, if nothing else, has experience showing up to family functions on time, which in Tanzanian politics now seems to be a transferable skill. Together, the daughter and son-in-law combo gave the government a certain buy one, get one minister aesthetic, leaving ordinary Tanzanians wondering whether the next reshuffle would include cousins, nephews, or perhaps a special desk for grandchildren to start their public service internships early. President Hassan insisted the entire reshuffle was based strictly on merit, though critics pointed out that if Tanzanian merit looks this hereditary, then the country might as well start printing government forms with preferred family connection as a mandatory field. Those same critics also argued this was not just about merit, but about cementing a more authoritarian posture, a continuation of the repressive legacy inherited from John Magufuli, whose death in 2021 placed Hassan in power and briefly earned her praise for lifting media bans before she reverted to the old classics: pre-election arrests, opposition disqualifications, and the now traditional Tanzanian election specials featuring curfews and a nationwide internet blackout. Because nothing says free and fair like forcibly unplugging an entire nation. Post-election, things didn't get better. Mass treason charges and delayed vote tallies completed in under 72 hours despite the chaos created a political environment so opaque even the results looked like they were afraid to show their real faces. When you combine that with the new family-heavy cabinet, you get a picture of a president not just consolidating power, but bubble-wrapping it, locking it in a cabinet and placing it safely next to her relatives, just to make sure the opposition doesn't breathe on it. Kikwete's promotion added even more flavor to this political stew, confirming that Tanzania's politics still runs on a mentorship system where the mentor's son gets promoted, the mentee's children get ministerial posts, and the general public, well, they get curfews. With President Hassan in her constitutionally final term, scrutiny is intensifying both inside and outside the country. This cabinet, instead of symbolizing fresh leadership, has become a neon sign flashing phrases like dynasty expansion, loyalty insurance, and second-term comfort zone. Yet the administration presents all of this with a straight face, insisting everything is normal, democratic, and properly managed, even as the rest of the continent shakes its head with the kind of disappointment only African mothers can muster when another country performs political gymnastics previously thought impossible. Tanzania now stands at a defining moment. A government insulated by family ties and political debts, a citizenry muted by repression, a youth population demanding more than symbolic ministries, and a region watching closely, wondering how a president once celebrated for easing restrictions ended up assembling a cabinet that looks like it was drafted during a family vacation. Until something changes, until a resignation, a reversal, a reform, or even an honest admission, the story remains the same. Tanzania is navigating a turbulent political landscape with a leadership style that mixes dynasty with suppression, loyalty with fear, and governance with the unmistakable scent of family perfume. And there you have it. A week where diplomacy became improv, leadership looked hereditary, and protocol wars were fought with the emotional maturity of a 2 a.m. voice note. But beneath the spectacle sits a continent negotiating its identity, pushing for global respect, navigating fractured alliances, and confronting leaders who confuse national duty with family planning. Africa's politics may be wild, but also It's painfully revealing, reminding us that history doesn't repeat itself. It simply updates the cast. If leaders want loyalty, they must earn it. If they want legitimacy, they must protect it. And if they insist on performing, then we, the audience, will keep laughing. But we're taking notes, just in case we need a second take.